I wouldn't thank you for a Valentine. I wouldn't wake up early wondering if the postman's been. Should 10 red-padded satin hearts arrive with sticky, sickly, saccharine sentiments in a very vulgar verses, I wouldn't wonder if you meant them. 2 dozen anonymous interflora red roses, I'd not bother to swither over who sent them. I wouldn't thank you for a Valentine. Scrawl "swark" across the envelope, I'd just say, same old story, I cannot be bothered deciphering it, I'm up to here with amore. The whole Valentine's Day thing is trivial and commercial, a cue for unleashing cliches and candy heart motives to which I personally am not partial. Take more than singing telegrams or pints of Chanel 5 or sweets to get me ordering oysters or ironing my black satin sheets. I wouldn't thank you for a Valentine. If you sent me a solitaire and promises solemn, took out an ad in the Guardian personal column, saying something very soppy, such as, "Who loves you, Pooh? I'll tell you I do, Fozzie Bear, that's who," you'd entirely fail to charm me. In fact, I detest it. I wouldn't be 18 again for anything. I'm glad I'm past it. I wouldn't thank you for a Valentine. If you sent me a single orchid or a pair of Janet Regers in a heart-shaped box and declared your love eternal, I'd say I'd not be caught dead in them, they were politically suspect, and I'd rather something thermal. If you hired a plane and blazed our love in a banner across the skies. If you bought me something flimsy in a flatteringly wrong size. If you sent me a postcard with 3 X's and told me how you felt, I wouldn't thank you, I'd melt. In this poem, the persona slams the commercialization of Valentine's Day, and for the vast majority of the poem, suggests that she would have no interest whatsoever in receiving tacky, generic, over-the-top, or overly sexualized gifts and messages. However, in the final 4 lines, she seems to change tack and implies that, actually, she is not completely opposed to receiving messages and gifts of love, provided they are appropriately simple and heartfelt.
The title of the poem, I Wouldn't Thank You for a Valentine, is repeated in the first line and at the end of every stanza. However, at the end of the final stanza, the refrain is tweaked to suggest a more ambivalent attitude towards Valentine's Day presents and messages. The effect of the refrain being repeated is to apparently suggest just how vigorously opposed the persona is to Valentine's Day and all it represents. Whatever the gifts, whatever the content of the messages, apparently the persona would not be appreciative. However, I wonder whether it's worth noting the tense used within the refrain, the conditional. It isn't the more definite future, I won't thank you, but a tense which opens up the possibility that, under particular circumstances, she might be prepared to show gratitude for a gesture presented on Valentine's Day. Nonetheless, she clearly enjoys taking the mick out of the tackiness and commercialization of Valentine's Day, as seen in the ludicrously over-the-top tautological sibilance spanning lines 3 to 4. The hearts arrive with sticky, sickly, saccharine sentiments. Not content with bombarding us with excessive sibilance, this is immediately followed by some concentrated alliterative V sounds, very vulgar verses. Vulgar is already a strong verb, meaning lacking sophistication or good taste, and if anything, adding the adverb very detracts from the overall effect. But this is the whole point. The type of sickening messages you get within Valentine's Day cards and messages are so tacky, so painfully gushing, so pathetically insinuating, that the language of the poem needs to reflect this silly excess. One of the inherent problems with Valentine's Day is that it has been hijacked by commercialization, meaning that personal messages can feel forced and fed rather than delivered intimately and spontaneously. Most of us consider flowers and roses beautiful, but the fact that they are delivered by an anonymous individual from a huge organization, Interflora, means that the gesture can no longer feel personal or particularly meaningful. So the persona dislikes the lack of personally generated thought within the climate of Valentine's Day, And this is also seen in the suggestion that many of us would scrawl "swark" across the envelope. Swark is short for "sealed with a loving kiss," and the failure to even bother to write this out smacks of lack of genuine care. And there is an argument really that this phrase shouldn't be written at all, but simply enacted. Meanwhile, the verb scrawl is a hurried, messy act of handwriting, further emphasizing the lack of deep care and consideration that undermines a day cynically earmarked for romance. In case we hadn't got the message clearly enough, the persona switches to dialogue within lines 9 to 13, so her anti-Valentine's Day sentiments come across even more directly. However, it's important to remember the poem remains laced with humour and signs of good old-fashioned Glaswegian no-nonsense attitude. The line, "I'm up to here with amore," does show that she isn't prepared to channel her behaviour based on Valentine's Day diktats, but it's also comic in the incongruous combination of the colloquial phrase, "I'm up to here," with "here" amusingly spelt wrong, and meaning that she has had enough of, and the lush Italian word for love, amore. I rather like the present participle unleashing used in relation to cliches. Usually this verb is used in far more physical or at least more vigorous contexts, such as unleashing your wild side, unleashing an animal, etc. However, here it suggests the torrent of dreadful cliches that are set upon the world on February the 14th. They enter our landscape with effervescent vigour, so that it is almost impossible to escape them. There are more incongruous combinations as the poem goes on, and in line 14 we have the suggestion that receiving pints of Chanel 5 on Valentine's Day would not in itself make the persona sexually amenable. I've just checked on Amazon, and a bottle of Chanel No. 5 is actually even more expensive than I realised. £158.49 for 100 mils, and this is apparently reduced from £189.95. Given that one pint is 568 mils, and if we take pints of Chanel 5 to mean just two, this would cost in the region of £1,800. So the persona is using hyperbole to suggest that excessive presents do not in themselves mean a great deal. They do not contribute meaningfully to any kind of relationships. Moreover, given that pints are normally referred to ale or beer rather than perfume, the whole notion of commercialized gifts being a romantic gesture is undermined. Oysters are a well-known aphrodisiac, whilst black satin sheets would not be used as a matter of course on a bed, let alone ironed. So both these phrases suggest that there may be an implicit expectation that couples need to make an effort to get in the mood for sex on Valentine's Day, something the persona rejects as unromantic and commercially pressurized. In lines 19 to 20, you can see the persona poking fun at particularly infantile nicknames, which surely should be confined to the private domain rather than exposed to the world within a naff national newspaper adverts. It is surely the foisting of the personal into the public domain which the persona objects to, rather than what couples choose to call each other within the safety of their own homes and relationships. Look at the rhymes in this section of the poem: solemn, column, pooh, who, and it. This move to more consistent, very basic rhymes highlights the lack of originality within institutionalized Valentine's Day directives, which implicitly demand that we operate as couples and behave in preordained Orwellian ways. There are feminist undertones in line 25 through the phrase politically suspect. This refers to the persona being given luxury lingerie, a gift that could be interpreted as objectifying the female and being influenced solely by the desire to have additional sex. The persona says here at least that she would not wear such sexy attire on principle and would prefer something comfortable and practical, such as thermal underwear. But this seems to be contradicted by the suggestion that she might melt if given something flimsy in a flatteringly wrong size. This may not necessarily be lingerie, but it does suggest some kind of sheer revealing dress or nightwear. Perhaps purchasing such clothing can be less political when the key message behind it is to show love or boost self-esteem by going for a lower size, rather than any instant demand for sex. What makes this poem harder to interpret is the fact that there are 3 anaphoric subordinate clauses separated by semicolons prior to the surprising final line claiming that she would melt. If the first 2 anaphoric phrases had full stops at the end, we would be able to separate them from the third, which shows how the persona would really appreciate a postcard containing genuine sentiments. But they are all linked by the semicolons, which suggests that the ludicrously over-the-top gesture of hiring a plane to show a banner, as well as the purchase of sexy clothing, would somehow be more acceptable than similar gestures which have previously been dismissed. However, perhaps there is a difference in that these 3 gestures all seem to prioritize the message ahead of an overly commercialized gift, albeit with the hiring of a plain banner presumably extremely expensive. As previously stated, the fact that something flimsy is in a flatteringly wrong size seems to suggest that she appreciates the implicit message about her own beauty, perhaps as much or even more than the gift itself. So how do we interpret this verb melt? For me, it suggests that the persona would be physically moved, would have her previously hard attitude soften a little by receiving a genuine declaration of love, even if perhaps in her heart of hearts she would prefer for this to be given to her every other day rather than Valentine's Day itself. Your turn. Plan topic sentences and juicy quotations, which could be weaved into an outstanding essay about the way the poet presents strong feelings in romantic relationships in this poem. It's pause time. The persona appears to despise superficial gestures of love, particularly those declared on Valentine's Day. Sticky, sickly, saccharine sentiments in very vulgar verses. The persona feels that Valentine's Day has become disgustingly commercial and that genuinely romantic relationships should not embrace such cringeworthy occasions. A cue for unleashing cliches and candy heart motifs. Nonetheless, the persona does recognize the value of genuinely personalized, simpler messages and gestures. I wouldn't thank you. I'd melt. Here's my model paragraph. The persona appears to despise superficial gestures of love, particularly those declared on Valentine's Day. Within the first stanza, she's scathing about conventional Valentine's Day messages, describing them as sticky, sickly, saccharine sentiments in very vulgar verses. Note the claustrophobic similarity between the 3 sibilant adjectives, all pointing towards the messaging being cloyingly, disgustingly sweet, and thus devoid of any genuine personal raw life meaning. In case the reader hasn't got the message about just how distasteful these lines are, the following line develops this idea further by describing the verses as very vulgar. Once again, we have the excessive, tacky alliteration reflecting the ostentatious yet superficial messaging, with the added suggestion that there may be tasteless references to Valentine's Day sex, or at least to an overall effect that is cheap and soul-destroying.